Blessings, beloveds. Welcome back to my channel, Anastasia, Cosmic Astrologer, with you guys today. And I'm doing a follow-up on the Yod aspect. There's been some requests for some sharing around the Yod aspect pattern with the moon as an apex planet. So I've spent a couple of hours prior to coming on to filming this today. So I did put a lot of effort and energy into what I've got for you guys. It took me a while to find somebody, as in a famous person, celebrity, who has the Yod aspect with the moon as an apex planet. But I finally found someone, and the person that I found is a very spectacular individual who's no longer with us, who basically was an inventor, a pioneer. And he has the Yod aspect in his chart, the Yod aspect pattern, and the moon is the apex planet. And it's quite fascinating when we actually look to this chart and look at how this apex moon played out for this particular individual. Now, this is quite an exceptional case because not everybody has created what he has. So it is a very special sort of example. But it is good to use these sorts of examples where we can identify and look at the person's life through the astrology, through the lens of astrology. There's so many different levels that we can be looking at this chart with. But anyway, today's focus is around the Yod. Now, with no further ado, the person that I'm going to be focusing on today is Alexander Graham Bell. Now, for those of you who don't know who he is, he's the person that created the telephone back in the 1800s. So he was born in the 1800s, and I've spent over an hour actually just reading his biography in terms of what's available on the internet. And God, there's just so much to his life and his story, and what drove him and what motivated him and what encouraged him and what inspired him to do the great work that he did. He wasn't only the inventor of the telephone, he was very involved with a lot of other projects. So basically he created the telephone, as we know, groundbreaking work in optical telecommunications, hydrofoils, and aeronautics as well, was areas that he researched and that he did some groundbreaking work in. And it's all really very quite extraordinary because this Yod really does feature these aspects of his life and what he achieved and what drove him and so on and so forth. So let's just go to his chart, because this is the best way to start to get a feel for what we're actually looking at here and what we're going to be focusing on. Okay, so here is Alexander Graham Bell's chart. Now, the time of birth, could be questionable. It's not a rectified time, but, let's just say that this is the approximate time, which would more or less leave most things as you see them in front of you at the moment. So his date of birth was the 3rd of March, 1847. He was a Pisces. He had a lot of Pisces, actually. We can see that he had Saturn in Pisces, Sun in Pisces. That's Vulcan, for those of you that don't know. Vulcan is always very close to the Sun, no more than 8 degrees away from the Sun usually. He has Pisces ascendant, and he has Mercury in Pisces. Now, Mercury is a very, very important planet. Now, where is the Yod? Okay, so the Yod, if you can remember from the previous video where I talked about Prince's chart, if you haven't seen that video, I suggest you watch it. There's a bit of information in there that I might not cover again today. But for those of you that haven't seen that video or who are not familiar with what a yod aspect pattern is, it is basically a configuration of 3 planets forming very specific aspects to each other. So in the case of Alexander, what we have is here is the moon in his 7th house in Virgo, and this is the apex planet of the yod. Now, the moon forms a quincunx or inconjunct to Neptune in Aquarius, and the moon forms an inconjunct or quincunx. I'm just using both those terms because some people are familiar with perhaps one of those terms and not everyone is familiar with both, but it means the same thing basically. Inconjunct, quincunx, is an aspect that is 150 degrees in distance. So the moon is quincunx Pluto in Aries. The moon is quincunx Neptune in Aquarius, and Neptune and Pluto form a sextile to each other. Okay, so a sextile is basically 60 degrees away. So if you were to count from 28 degrees of Aquarius to 24 degrees of Aries, that would be very close to 60 degrees. It's not exact, but it would be very close. So that's the sextile between Neptune and Pluto, which is really very fascinating with what this man actually did. And I'll start to unpack layer by layer and see how we go. I've got a lot of information, but it literally would take me a couple of hours to unpack everything, just with the yod and just all the information that I read. And I don't want to do that because it can just be a really super long video. Okay, so Neptune's in the 12th, and Pluto is in the 1st house in Aries, and the moon is in Virgo in the 7th. So that's the yod, that configuration of those 3 planets. Now, I don't know if you've seen the previous video, so just in case you haven't, I made a comment about pay very close attention to a planet that forms an opposition to the apex planet of a yod. In this case, what we have in Alexander's chart is Mercury in Pisces forms an opposition to the moon in the 7th. So we have a yod configuration with the moon, Neptune, and Pluto, and Mercury is sitting right in between these planets that sextile each other, the Neptune and the Pluto. But more importantly, Mercury is forming an opposition to the moon. And if this time of birth is correct, then this opposition is exact by degree. This is a very important planet. Now think about, what does Mercury represent? It represents literally the written and spoken word on all levels. It represents speech. It also represents hearing as well. So I highly recommend, for those of you that are really serious about learning astrology, to actually get this book here. You should be able to see the title, and the author's name is underneath the title. This book is seriously an absolute gem. It's golden. I have shown this book in previous videos, but if you're wondering what it is, it's called the Rulership Book, as you can see. But what it has is everything from A to Z, anything you can think of, any word you can think of, from cauliflower to a bike, to a country, to an illness, to absolutely anything, okay, is in this book. And what you get to see is what sign, planet, or house connects to any given thing that you're wanting to understand. So if you want to know what rules cauliflower, funny example, but it's stuck in my head because I saw it when I was looking some things up. You just go to this book. You'd look up the word cauliflower under C, and you would find what rules cauliflower, which is the moon, by the way, in case you're wondering. Sleep, deformities, altered state of consciousness, chakras, bones, teeth, nose, eyes, the body. Absolutely everything is in this book. So I highly recommend you get it. So when you want to, like, for example, I said that Mercury connects to speech, the written and spoken word, and it also connects to hearing. Now, these are all very, very crucial points with regards to Alexander's chart, because he was an inventor of the telephone, which, by the way, when you actually, and if you do, but if you don't, here is a summary. When you read what he actually went through to actually create the telephone, the process and the work and the research and the investigation and the practice and the experimentation, the amount of work that took is phenomenal. And his level of dedication was phenomenal. He was an incredibly driven young man from a very young age. Now, this Mercury opposing the moon, the apex planet in this yod, is a highly emphasized Mercury, and it really describes basically what he did. Now, we know the yod symbolizes some special fate or destiny, something very important that the person needs to work through and integrate. So when we look at this yod, we can see that there's two outer planets forming a sextile. Now, another very important point for this particular yod is that Alexander has Pluto as part of his yod. And as I said in the previous video, and I will say it again, many authors are in agreement that a true yod is really formed when Pluto is actually at the apex point, okay? Because the yod really is characterized by what Pluto signifies, which is evolution, transformation, destiny, death, rebirth, things of that nature. So when you see Pluto configuring in a yod aspect pattern, you know that this yod is really paramount because Pluto is figuring in it, even though Pluto is not at the apex. The moon is at the apex in this chart, and this really speaks to pretty much how Alexander got started on his journey with why he created the telephone and how he created it, and what was going on before all of that. As I said, I did a lot of reading, and I was so overwhelmed by everything I was reading. But a few key points. Alexander was very, very close to his family. He had two brothers, and he was very close to his mother and his father. His father was also a professional person and was quite well known for the things that he did. So Alexander was very disciplined and supported by his father. Now we can see the discipline by, if you look at his sun, it's conjunct Saturn. Now Saturn is always about discipline and hard work, and this man worked very, very hard at what he did. I can't even begin to encapsulate or summarize really everything that this man actually did. But, you know, he was a genius. He was a scientist. He was an inventor. By the way, hydrofoils, for those of you that don't know, is I find this just really quite funny. Let me just go to my computer is just running a little bit slow here. Okay, so hydrofoils is something that connects to, if you can imagine, like an aircraft that basically takes off from the sea. So those little aircrafts that have those little spinning engines, and they're called hydrofoils, right? You've probably seen them. They're very old. They've been around for a long time. I'll tell you what it says here. A hydrofoil is a lifting surface or foil that operates in water. Okay, so it's that little aircraft that operates from running off the water, the ocean. Now, you might be thinking, well, okay, how does this connect? Well, it connects because Neptune rules hydrofoils. It rules water. And this man was responsible for groundbreaking work in hydrofoils, right? Back in the 1800s. It's a long time ago. So there's Neptune configuring in this yod, and that's what that connects to in terms of his inventions and what he created. Okay. If we think about Pluto, now Pluto was in Aries in this man's chart. It was a long time ago. Pluto in Aries is obviously somebody who's going to be a pioneer, right? So pioneering, transforming something for the collective. That's pioneer, entrepreneur. Period. Pluto in Aries. This man created the telephone. That speaks for itself. So that's where you see that Pluto in Aries energy really coming through. Okay, so that Pluto sextiling Neptune, that had a lot of energy connecting to the transpersonal planets, which is Pluto, evolution, transformation, Aries, pioneering, groundbreaking, which is what this man did in a number of streams, but he's obviously most famous for the telephone. And the Neptune connects to the hydrofoils, as I said, as well. Connects to many other things because we know that the 12th house is totally multidimensional. It's so multi-layered. It connects to the collective and so forth as well. Now, the moon, it's a very interesting configuration, having the moon at the apex. And I will read you what the moon as an apex planet means from the source that I use in terms of understanding yods. And I will tell you what that book is. I have referred to this book many times, and I've listed it in some of my videos. But for those of you that may be watching for the first time, I will mention it again so that you can get it yourself if you wish to. Now, the moon plays a very important role because it is the apex planet. As I said, Mercury is at the opposite point of the moon, so Mercury becomes a highly prominent planet that's going to describe a lot of what this yod is really about, which for him was Mercury, telephone, communication, speech and hearing. Now, the reason I say speech and hearing is because Alexander was actually, he ended up being a professor, and professors are ruled by Mercury, Jupiter, Saturn, Sagittarius. Mercury, Jupiter, Sagittarius, and Saturn are the archetypal energies you associate with a professor. Now, Mercury is a very, very prominent planet in his chart, so there's Mercury connecting to him being a professor. It's connected into this yod because it's opposite the moon. Saturn is conjunct his sun, so there's more interpretation of that Sun-Saturn conjunction. He became a professor in universities and schools. He taught many different things, but his main passion was actually working with deaf people. And this is what really started his whole journey with wanting to create a telephone as well. When he was 12 years of age, his mother basically ended up becoming deaf. Obviously, there must have been ongoing issues with her hearing for some time, and by the time he was 12, she was completely deaf. Now, this man was very, very close to his mother, and this his mother going deaf was a real driving force and motivator for him to want to learn how to communicate with deaf people. And that's exactly what he did. He basically, as he went on, before the whole telephone thing came about, he was experimenting with different things regarding, I've just forgotten the terminology, but regarding whatever was involved with creating a telephone, these technological lines and graph lines and, I don't know, just electrical circular currents and energy and all this sort of stuff. I'm not versed in the language of that technical component of what he did, so I'm just trying to keep it very simple. But what he did was he worked with people who were deaf, basically, and he worked with them very, very closely on a one-on-one basis. He spent many years doing this, even when he was, well known for what he had achieved, all the recognition he got. He was awarded with, prize bells and whatever you call them, all that sort of stuff. He created the company that was called the Bell something company, which was the first telephone company, and so forth. His real passion lied in basically helping people who are deaf to be able to communicate. And he tried these very unusual, extraordinary techniques and skills that are really out of my league to even begin to really describe in terms of that field. But we can really relate that to the Mercury in Pisces, because Mercury is all about speech, hearing, communication, teaching, learning, all that sort of stuff. And in Pisces, we have that beautiful, compassionate, sensitive being that's driving the person, right? So there's that. I mean, Mercury in Pisces is in its detriment, but in this case, it really, really excelled in terms of what it drove him to achieve, and the compassion that he had, first of all, for his mother, because his mother went deaf when he was 12, and how that led him into having so much empathy and compassion and devotion and dedication to working with people who are deaf on a one-on-one basis. He was very, very passionate about that. So that's the Mercury configuring in basically creating the telephone and working with people who had speech impediments, who had deafness issues. Some were partially deaf, some were completely deaf, things like that. So that's how we can interpret and understand why and how this Mercury was super important. And like I said at the beginning, when you have a planet opposite the apex planet, it really emphasizes very strongly what's going to evolve, basically, with this Yod configuration. Now, the moon in Virgo is very interesting as well, because Virgo rules techniques, skills, practicing, mastering, perfecting things, and so forth. And this guy, what he did and what he created, he didn't pull it out of a hat. It didn't fall out of the sky. This guy worked day in, day out. He really worked very, very hard at mastering, and they called him a master at his craft in terms of what he was able to create and what he was able to achieve with deaf people. That's the moon in Virgo as well. But the moon is also his mother, you see, and it's also his early childhood and his home life and so forth. Now, Mercury actually rules his IC, the fourth house, right down here at the bottom of the chart. So that Mercury, which configures in the Yod planetary aspect pattern, is connected to the fourth house. And that's important because all his work, his whole family was very, very connected with him, and he was very connected to his family. And there was a lot of support from his family. They were never really separated as such. They really were a very close clan and worked together. His father helped him quite a bit in introducing him to a lot of different people and basically helping him on his path and on his journey. So family, here's an example as well of where you see the fourth house is empty. And people sometimes assume when a house is empty, it's not that important. But, here's an example of how important this person's family actually was. So much so that the condition of his mother's deafness led this guy to basically working an entire lifetime of basically helping people who were deaf, helping them with different techniques, helping them. Because one thing that I read as well is that he wanted to get away from the sign language that was created for deaf people. He wanted more for deaf people. He wanted to be able to teach deaf people how to actually speak. So, I don't even know what that involves. I mean, but you can imagine how how incredibly challenging and complex that would be, to teach, because he worked with people who were deaf from birth and people who eventually just ended up with deafness for whatever reason or reasons that was. So he worked with quite a different stream of people, but all of which basically had this medical problem. And he did this really until the end of his life. He was a professor, he was a teacher, he worked with people one-on-one. The one-on-one component, by the way, also connects to the moon being in the seventh house. The seventh house is the Libran house. It's where we interact and engage with people on a one-on-one level. It's the house of relationships and marriage, sure, but it's also any form of relationship or engagement that we have on a one-on-one basis, right? That's the seventh house experience. So that moon in the seventh house, he had such a sensitivity on an emotional level, right? And he was nurturing and very, very caring to these people that he worked with on a one-on-one basis, where he taught them how to speak. It's a massive deal. It's a big deal, what he did. So this is part of how we see the moon reflected in this apex, being the apex in this Yod configuration. So I've given some key points of how to understand this particular Yod for this particular individual. What else did I want to say about this? So he also opened a school for vocal physiology and mechanics of speech, right? He opened a school for that, right? There's that Mercury configuring in this Yod aspect pattern. As I said, he eventually became a professor. He worked very closely with people on a one-on-one basis. That was the other point I wanted to make. This seventh house, or any seventh house, when you are very, very young, the seventh house, when you've got planetary configurations in the house, when you've got planets in the seventh house, that seventh house is experienced when you're very young in your family environment, with your family, in your home life. Early home life can also be seen through the seventh and the eighth house, by the way, and obviously the fourth house. And the third house can bring more to it, but the third house is more about your sort of local immediate environment and your early years in school. So it's still part of your young years of life. But when you're talking about the seventh house, any planets in the seventh house, what happens, and this happens in adulthood as well, but more so in childhood, whatever planets we have in there, we project them, onto our family members, parents usually. So that's part of the seventh house interpretation as well. And there's the moon there, the moon's very sensitive there in that seventh house and in Virgo, opposite Mercury in Pisces, and the sextiles between Neptune and Pluto. So this Yod, having two outer planets, transpersonal, transcendental planets in this Yod, really says to me that the work that this man did, which is speaks for itself, it was so transpersonal. It was so involved with the collective. It was pioneering on a collective level, because look at what the telephone has led to. Remember the olden days. Some of you might not, because you won't be old enough, but I'm old enough to have lived where I used to use, the landline, where you'd used to dial the numbers like this, and you'd pick up the telephone. And European people are very funny. The older generation of Europeans who have a landline, not necessarily those old phones, they'll have a push-button phone now, because they grew up in the generations that they did. There was a sense that when you're speaking to somebody on the telephone, on those old telephones, and you're calling somebody who's overseas, something happens to the psyche, and the person feels that they need to yell, so they're yelling on the telephone when they're speaking to a family member who lives in another country. It's quite funny how this happens, but I've observed this through the years, and um, uh, parents from my parents' generation, for instance, they still kind of do that, even though they have mobile phones or whatever the case. Anyway, that's just a funny side note, I think. Um, but getting back to Alexander, as I said, Pluto in Aries, pioneer, entrepreneur, he created something that had never been created before. And as I was saying a moment ago, look at where we are today with the telephone. We now have a telephone, which is a computer. As we all know, you can do just about anything through an iPhone these days. I mean, we're talking about technology has advanced so much, obviously, through the decades in the last 100 years, or um, probably even more so in the last 20 to 30 years when we're talking about internet and things like that. But this guy was the guy who started everything that we have eventually reached at this point. This was the pioneer, Pluto in Aries. And it's in a Yod aspect configuration with Neptune. Neptune connects to the collective. Aquarius connects to, innovative, inventive uh, projects, ideas, tasks, and so forth. The moon in Virgo is craft, skills, perfectionism, technical things, and so forth. So you can see it's all there. And the moon in the seventh, as I said, very much connects to the one-on-one interactions he had when he worked very closely with people who were deaf, whether they were born deaf or whether they incurred that later on in life. He had so much empathy and compassion and passion to helping these people. And as I said, it wasn't just about staying and being satisfied with sign language. He wanted to create more for people who were deaf so that they can use more than just their hands to communicate. Okay, so that's it in a nutshell. I hope you found that interesting. I certainly did when I read it. Now, when I read his history, that is, and when I sat with the chart and just reflected on it, and things just started lighting up for me as I was reading his history. I was reading his history and I was looking at the chart, reading, looking, reading, looking. That's what I do, So it's really a wonderful way to bring the chart to life, because that chart it's a living, breathing combination of cosmic forces that come alive when a person is born, right? Obviously. And as that person is living and breathing and evolving and living and just growing through life, all these beautiful, beautiful cosmic forces in the chart and fractal. There's all these little fractal things in the chart as well. That's why it's multi-layered and multi-dimensional. And when you look at a harmonic chart, for example, I have done a couple of videos on harmonic charts, so have a look at those if you want to hear more about some specific harmonics that I've done videos on, which I think was the ninth harmonic, and I've done the fifth harmonic, and perhaps another one I can't quite recall. But the harmonic chart is like looking at fractals of your birth chart. When you look at the fifth harmonic chart, what you're actually looking at, I know I'm deviating a little bit, but this is important just to help us understand. When you're looking at this birth chart that you are looking at right now, there's so many layers that your naked eye can absolutely not see. So when you do a harmonic chart, for instance, let's just say that we draw a fifth harmonic chart. Well, the fifth harmonic chart shows you all the various components and fractals of the fifth house, of the birth chart. it's just so magical to me. It's so wonderful that there's so many layers to an actual birth chart. So, you know, when you're looking at a chart, just as you are now on the screen that you see through this video, you know, it's really important to understand that what you immediately see is just one level. There's literally hundreds of levels hidden in the birth chart. And when we look at an aspect pattern, such as the yod, we're zoning in or zooming in to one particular dimension of this particular birth chart. When we're looking at a fifth harmonic chart, we're zooming in to another particular dimension of this birth chart. So you can hopefully understand from what I've just said that this is why the birth chart is so incredibly complex and so multi-dimensional. And this is just one example. Okay, so I'd like to just read to you to finish this video up for today what Bill Tini says about the apex moon. So this is the book in case you are interested. Dynamics of Aspect Analysis, Bill Tini. This guy's amazing. This book was written in the 1970s, and this is my absolute go-to book for so many different things. It's a book that you will invest in, that you will never ever just put aside and hardly go to it. It's an incredibly valuable book. So I recommend that if you are serious about astrology, that you invest in this. It's golden. Okay, apex moon. Now, as I start to read this, you know, there's, I would say that this first large paragraph I'm going to read is difficult for us to truly understand how this played out in Alexander Graham Bell, because everything I've discussed so far is really about his profession, right? The personal component that I've been able to draw from and bring in is the sheer fact that he was incredibly close with his family. That's his private life. And the love that he had for his mother, and the experience around her going deaf when he was 12, and what that basically lit up in him, what that woke up in him, that begun his journey and led him to pretty much everything he created. I mean, he was a genius, right? So this first paragraph is going to be challenging for us to really understand, because we don't know Alexander on a personal level. We don't know how he felt internally within himself and subjectively. This is the other point about the moon being at the apex point. The moon is such an incredible subjective body, okay? So the moon being the apex planet in a yod configuration, it's quite a subjective experience for the individual. So if we don't know somebody personally, it can be very difficult to delineate 100% how this basically showed up for him or how he related to this. But as I continue to read further, there's just a couple of really striking comments that this book makes about the apex moon that we can actually 100% relate to Alexander Graham Bell and the yod in his birth chart, with the moon being the apex. So I'll just read a little bit from the first paragraph. The apex moon denotes an individual whose inner emotional development is in need of sensitive adjustment. This person can still be caught up with disorganized, distorted impressions of the past that need to be objectively observed and clarified before his feelings can be free to further grow and thrive. This is a very personal, private apex planet, which is what I was just saying a moment ago. Potential emotional male adjustments are seldom evident on the surface. The individual may even be unaware of these conflicts due to the subconscious nature of the moon, plus its capacity to condition behavior in a very subtle, subjective manner. his instinctual response, the moon rules our instincts, right? Your instinctual behaviors and patterns is all regulated by the moon in your birth chart. The moon drives all of that, and it's almost always out of your control. It's instinctual, it just comes up. His instinctual response to impressions from the environment can be out of tune with what would normally be expected, since this highly reactive individual does not easily decode the emotional messages he receives from others. It's a very interesting point. For those of you who have moon in apex, I suspect you would be able to resonate, with that comment. He may even attempt to screen them out in an obliquely self-protective manner. Remember, the apex planet is quite a sensitive planet, right? And in this case, it's the moon, so it's a highly sensitized apex planet because it's the moon. The moon is a very, very sensitive body. There may be some emotional trauma from the past, perhaps stemming from previous incarnations, and then repeated in theme again in early childhood. Now, a couple of other things that I forgot to mention. His early childhood wasn't easy. He was very driven and very motivated and very empathetic and compassionate, and he was an explorer with his mind, and he was, I think he was just a very, very advanced soul, really. You'd have to be to create what he has. But I suspect this moon being so sensitive, he was, so tuned into his mother that, you could almost say that she was the advocate for what he was to become, because her going deaf had such a big impact on him. The other thing about his early childhood was that two of his siblings, he had two brothers, and they both died from tuberculosis. I've just forgotten how to even pronounce it. Tuberculosis. Is that right? It is tuberculosis. Close enough, near enough. I'm sure you all get what I'm saying. So both of his brothers died from that particular condition, disease, whatever you want to call it. And one of his brothers died quite young. So there's some trauma in the family, and look at that. Mercury in Pisces in detriment, right? So we could almost say that detrimental Mercury in Pisces connects to his brothers being very ill. Both of them were very ill. Both of them died very early in life, one a little bit later and one quite early. Mercury rules his fourth house, and it rules his third house. Third house is siblings. Fourth house is family. So can you see how when you start to join the dots, you pretty much fill out the narrative, the story, as far as we can get from what's offered through resources online, at least. Okay, that comment about trauma, which can also connect to previous incarnations and early childhood, or repeat in early childhood in this incarnation. And I've just stated that I think that trauma was connected to his brothers dying through a pretty serious illness and his mother who went deaf as well. So the family stuff was quite big for him. It was a big motivator for what he eventually achieved and created as well. And okay, to go on further, apex moon suggests faulty assimilation of impressions that nevertheless trigger this person to react in a habitually self-defeating way. Now, we don't know how this played out for Alexander. We can't know. Do you guys know him? I don't. So we don't know him on that personal level, right? Although he needs a great amount, but I'm reading this for the benefit of you guys, because I know there will be lots of you watching who have the moon as an apex planet in a yod in your birth chart, because there's been a few requests for this video. So here I am doing it for you guys. Although he needs a great amount of closeness and intimacy from those he can trust and allow himself to feel nourished by, he typically can feel out of focus with others and may withdraw into a psychological shell in an attempt to find shelter and refuge wherever he fails to adjust the emotional realities of any union. I would imagine the apex planet undergoes its important strain period during the individual's early development years, implying that this yod may be activated as soon as the person reaches adulthood. And I think we can see this in Alexander's life, because his journey, the moon, you could say, was activated really at the age of 12 when his mum went deaf, right? That was the driving force for his lifelong work and journey, working with deaf people. Don't forget, Mercury is opposite that moon, okay? And Mercury describes all the work that he did, as does the moon in Virgo and the moon in the 7th house. Okay. Once this yod is fully activated, the individual is to embark upon, now this is the component that I feel we can very clearly see in Alexander's life and chart from everything that I've pointed to thus far, okay? There's a lot more to this, but this is enough to give you a feel, I think. I hope. Okay. Once this yod is fully activated, the individual is to embark upon a destined change of life, a destined change of life patterning that could leave him free from negative images of the past. Due to subtle yet constant reorganization of the feeling nature, he has inwardly prepared himself for a life direction, enabling him to soothe or nurture others. Now, he did this when he worked with people who were deaf. That's that moon in the 7th. He was a nurturer, but because it was in Virgo, he came up with practical, skillful ways of how he could help these people. And that's indeed what he did. His maternal instinct has undergone needed regeneration, so that now a new path may open up, permitting him to attend to the basic needs of populace to defend the interests of the weaker or help others establish fundamental securities. That's a very powerful statement, and I can see that very clearly in Alexander, because somebody who is deaf, perhaps not so much nowadays, but can you imagine in the 1800s what it would be like to be deaf? Imagine what the world looked like then. Very different to the world we live in today. The amount of resources available now for people, who are deaf, the inventions, the things that have helped people who have this sort of condition, is back in the 1800s, it would have been a tremendous sense of insecurity in an individual, and they would have felt weaker. They would have, because of the context of the world and the environment they lived in at that time. It's important to understand this, because this is the chart we're looking at. We're looking at the chart of a man who lived in those times and who was driven to help these people speak, hear, feel normal. Regardless of what life now presents to him, this individual finds himself strengthened by his inner foundation and advantageously nourished by his resembled emotional resources. Personal needs are more clarified, directly expressed, and easily fulfilled. So that's what Biltini says about the apex moon. And as I said, those last couple of lines particularly I felt really powerful in connecting to Alexander Graham Bell's Yod. So I think that's all I wanted to really focus on for today. Again, hope you guys have found this video useful and educational, and I hope it enables you to understand your own yod further from the point of view of, understanding the things that I pointed to, the houses, the planets, what do the planets represent, the signs, I've touched on all of that. The planets that the houses rule, all those things, the planets that form the yod, what houses are they in, and therefore what do they show? We talked about Pluto in Aries. Now, Pluto was also in the first house. So talk about a soul who was here to evolve not only himself, but the collective through what he was able to create. Pluto in Aries in the first house. That's a damn powerful Pluto. And it was his destiny, right? Because the yod represents one's destiny. So there you have it. Okay, thanks guys for tuning in, and thanks for all your comments and questions, and thanks for subscribing. And I'll be back with something else. Probably my next video might be the March update, but we'll see. We'll see. I whatever I say I'm going to do next, I never end up doing. I always end up doing something else. So I don't know why I bother saying it. But anyway, feel free to contact me for a reading. I offer many different types of readings. I work very heavily from the evolutionary paradigm, the evolutionary model of astrology, which is very Pluto focused, nodal focused, moon focused, and so forth. I basically work with a quite an eclectic platform in terms of what I use to zoom in and delineate a person's chart. So you could be at any stage in your life with profession or relationships or creative projects or relocation, or could be anything. So there's many different types of readings. If you've never had a reading, I highly encourage you to do so. It doesn't have to be through me, but if you do feel a connection with me and how I work, then please feel free to email me. All my details will be in the description box below. And feel free to ask any questions about this video if you have any. And see you guys soon. Hope you're all doing well. Much love and blessings. Thanks. Bye.